Today's topic will be on 5 top tips for better science posters. Um, if you've joined our previous webinars before, we are doing a series throughout the month of April and May, so stay tuned for that schedule to come out. And basically, what we'll cover today is sort of a quick 60-second intro into the work we've sort of done as medical illustrators, and then jump sort of right into the 5 main design tips on making better science posters. We'll leave some time at the end kind of for some fun sort of live poster making sessions, um, kind of revamping a real life scenario of a poster with good content but might need some design tweaks into a well designed format using some of the tips and tricks that we'll go through in the beginning. What this session will not cover are things like how to pare down your content for your poster. This is something that you should prepare before you begin your poster making. It does take a bit of extra thought, but it'll make a world of a difference as you go to design your posters. This will also not be a full tutorial on excuse me, how to use BioRender. We actually have dedicated webinars for this. They're sort of a 1 hour, free crash course on how to use BioRender. So we'd love to have you attend if you haven't already. They're a lot of fun and they run about every other Wednesday. In fact, we have one coming up this Wednesday, April 22nd. You may have joined yesterday's, which we also ran similarly. So we'll link that at the end of this webinar, as well as in a follow-up email if you are interested to kind of get a bit of more of a deep dive into the BioRender application itself. Okay, and the recording for this webinar will be available after today's session. So if you signed up with a specific email, just check the inbox for that email that you registered for this webinar for. Fantastic. So we've got a very full room. I think there are over 500 people. Actually, we had about 3,000 registrants. So the room is filling up as we speak. So we're all in good company. Really excited to be sharing some tips with you today from all over the world. Let's dive right in. For those that haven't heard of BioRender before, I see some familiar names in the chat, so I'm sure many of you have, but if you haven't, BioRender is essentially an online program for creating high quality scientific images. We also run webinars like this, so this is a snapshot into the kinds of webinars we run. We did one for grant images, slide decks, and then today, of course, is about posters. But the application itself for the figure making part is called BioRender, designed for scientists in industry and academia, both students, instructors, healthcare professionals, science communicators, and more. Generally, if you have little to no art background and little to no time, it is a great alternative to creating really high quality science figures. Everything you see here is made by professional medical illustrators, so it's scientifically vetted, accurate, up to date. And we do have a scientific kind of advisory board that helps us keep everything relevant, up to date, and accurate. So a few common use cases for BioRender, just to kind of run through that really quickly, are publications, presentations, lab meetings, poster figures. So certainly today we're going to be covering poster figures as well as how to design your entire poster. A bit about ourselves. My training is in specifically medical and biological illustration, if we haven't already met, and had my training initially at National Geographic magazine, leading their science illustration efforts. And currently, I'm leading the team at BioRender here, fantastic team of technologists, medical illustrators, scientists, and really science communication enthusiasts. And of course, that includes Francesca, who, as I mentioned, is on the chat line today, helping to answer some questions you might have as we go through the session. So, while working at Nat Geo, one of our biggest tasks was actually to format a lot of information onto a single printed page. And that meant adhering to a lot of design principles. As professionals, we often don't explicitly talk about because they've become kind of second nature to us. So things like padding, margins, color contrast, print resolution, even those are things that we really go over and go through in a lot of detail on a day to day. So today, we want to kind of elucidate and extrapolate some of that information and make it digestible in an easy to use way for science poster making, because there are a lot of parallels drawn between the two. Now, specific to research posters, our team at BioRender has been very curious about how to optimize creating the best scientific or research poster. Um, we actually surveyed probably thousands of scientists at this point, and we actually handmade a few hundred posters. I think a few of you on the line here were very generous with your time to help us go through that process. And we really wanted to see, collaborating closely with researchers around the world to see if we could kind of find a common thread that made a poster successful or unsuccessful design-wise. And we came up with a few things that will just sort of scratch the surface on today, but you've probably seen the plethora of types of designs that you'll come across as far as how to design a poster. There aren't any hard and fast rules as far as the type of poster you should create, but there are certainly guidelines that we should follow so that you can add your own creative flair on top of that. This was a photo taken at the Society for Neuroscience conference back in the fall. Pretty crazy to think about mass gatherings right now. It feels like ages ago that we were able to gather like this. But for those, that have gone to conferences, I suspect many of you have and will be, hopefully in the not so distant future. You know how overwhelming it can be at a poster hall at a conference. So I think SFN brings in, tens of thousands of posters. I see some sad faces. Yeah, I know. I don't know if you're sad facing about the poster making or the lack of being able to go to a conference. I guess both. 35,000 attendees. That's right, Emily. And as far as posters, there were certainly tens of thousands. Um, yeah, I miss it too. It's really sad to not be able to see you all in person at a conference right now. So, and this was just, a few months ago. But basically, we took some pictures during that session and realized that your design has to be so clean and easy to understand because there's already so much noise that you're competing with at an event, or even, at smaller meetings, if that's the reason why you're creating a poster. I actually really like this student's poster, which is why I wanted to highlight it here. It was very well designed, clean headers. The only thing that's unfortunate is, when you have these kind of folds or wrinkles, if you printed your poster on fabric. So, I've actually been told that hanging up your poster in your hotel room with the shower door open will steam it flat, but I'm not sure how effective that is. I don't have a solution for this of how to pin up your poster well, but if you have suggestions or hacks, please feel free to add that to the chat. You can iron it. Yep. Thanks, Chloe. Ironing. I guess if it's not printed on any kind of plastic sheet, you could definitely iron it. A few other examples here just to show you the variety of posters out there. Some with simpler designs, some with a good balance of figures and text. But again, wrinkles, creases can be quite distracting. So I definitely feel for all of you having to deal with not only the logistics of making a poster, getting it printed, but then also getting it to display right on the wall. Yeah, sounds like ironing it will do the job. Roll it, don't fold it. Yeah, I like that, Jenna. So diving right into the sort of 5 tips here, we've tried to sort of consolidate it into 5 topics or tips. Of course, these are kind of going to bleed into each other a little bit. And there were probably 100 tips that we could have covered and would have loved to cover. But these 5 sort of bubbled up as a few that were kind of consistently troublemakers or things that stuck out as we went through our poster studies. So what I'll do is, because these themes overlap quite a bit, I'm going to touch on a few of these in the following slides, and then the rest I'll actually show through example by actually creating parts of a poster together with you in real time. I think it's safe to say that probably about 90% of posters will and should follow this sort of general flow like this. So top to down, left to right. You can have a portrait format or landscape, of course, but generally we recommend this, directionality of information. You can get a bit wacky with sort of circular formats, but those unique formats are really hard to do well, and they should really be reserved for special use cases. So don't try to reinvent the wheel. Let's stick with something, pretty classic. I know the Better Poster is also a popular format. If your conference allows for it, you can certainly, try that out. Um, One thing, going back to sort of my 5 tips here, the idea of arranging sections in a grid, basically, Chicago, not Paris. What that means is if you're from Chicago, if you've ever been to Chicago, you'll know that everything is extremely grid-like. So I know I was there recently for a conference, which escapes me now which one it was. ASCB maybe, or ACR, one of the big ones. Anyway, I got lost, and then asking for directions was really easy. It's 3 blocks south, 2 blocks north, and where you are. ACR, okay, that's where it was. Thanks, Manlio. So it is windy in Chicago, but it's really easy to find get your bearings and find where you're going, especially say you don't have Google Maps. Um, Compare that to a city like Paris, which is beautiful city, fun to get lost in if you don't live there or have somewhere to get to in a time sensitive way. But as a tourist or a stranger, you would definitely get lost without some sort of GPS system. And this is kind of how we see a lot of posters being displayed. Is it's very hard to organize your information in a way that even if you're not standing next to your poster, your audience can actually follow the information from A to B, or 1, 2, and 3. So keep this in mind as you're designing your poster. Don't send your user off into get lost in the information. Really follow the grid system, and I'll show you exactly what that means. um, just to touch on, actually, this is something that doesn't really fit into a category, but it's just general tips on what not to do as far as aesthetics or outdated styles. We get this question a lot about, why does my poster look a little bit out of date? And usually it's one of these 5 things. Rounded corners tend to be out of style, drop shadows, gradients, very difficult to do tastefully. And then, all of the sort of defaults that came with PowerPoint 1999 version. So, maybe someday someone will be watching this in 10 years and realize these styles may have come back into fashion, but I don't really see that happening. So in general, try to avoid using these, I guess, design elements in your poster. Gradients are typically, explicitly difficult to use, and we see this a lot. Poster backgrounds using a gradient are, it serves a lot of, it kind of creates a lot of problems. So one is, we already looked at the sort of creasing or wrinkling that happens with posters. You're already creating a disadvantage to yourself by making a gradient background, because it actually looks like the paper is curling on the edges. It's just an optical illusion, but it doesn't look kind of flush and clean, and you don't get that grid-like format if you add a gradient to your background. Here again, they've used rounded corners, so it kind of again gives it that dated look to it. So I would just sharpen out the corners, flatten out the background color, so you're not dealing with this sort of shift in hue. And yeah, don't use Comic Sans is what I'm seeing. um, This is interesting. So definitely try using grid lines when you're kind of aligning all of your sections and margins and columns. And I'll get into how to do this in the demo. But just keep this in mind that this is a really important feature that as professional designers we use um, consistently. So if you were to walk into a design studio, most people's monitors would be showing these kind of fuchsia grid lines because this is kind of our bread and butter as far as making sure everything's aligned and not trusting your eye. So here's an example of a poster that didn't use grids and guidelines, and here is one that does. So you can see removing the lines allows you to kind of see how those sort of hallways are created, that sort of visual breathing space. So definitely keep that in mind. Yeah, definitely, you're right. Agree with the comments here that it gives it a nice, clean, professional style. And the grid lines, those are inherent to many apps. BioRender does include it. PowerPoint has it. Adobe Illustrator. So definitely take advantage of it. And it's not permanent. You can actually hide it and turn it on and off. And I'll show you how to do that. My demo is actually going to be using Google Slides. I don't know if any of you use Google Slides to make posters. It's pretty much similar to PowerPoint. It's kind of just pick your poison at this point, but Google Slides does a decent job. I also like the what we've coined the TLDR format. Too long, didn't read. I mean, most posters are too long anyway, but in our research of the thousands of scientific posters, we actually realized that there's probably one or two sections that you should be highlighting, and the rest can kind of fall into a skinny column like this. So that was one of the tips of the 5 that we showed earlier, was to kind of pick one section that you really want to highlight, and then, don't let that compete with the other sections. Let it take up as much space as it needs, and then the rest can kind of fall in line, kind of on the side like this for the portrait format, or for the landscape format, you can kind of highlight it in the middle. Generally speaking, we're noticing that about 90% of posters want to highlight the results section, and that tends to be the biggest, the one with the most data, most figures, most captions. And so boxing it off like this creates a really nice sort of direction for the eye to look at. So that's the sort of TLDR format. And then a few smaller sort of practical tips before we get into the demo itself is this is a ridiculous picture. I'm sorry I picked this Shutterstock one. I don't think anyone's ever this excited to make a poster. But what I sometimes do is project the poster on, say, a TV screen or a projector or a monitor that is as big as the final will be printed. And that way, it actually gives me an idea of how big the font is. Is it going to register? Is my font too small in some areas? Sometimes it's even too big, where I can afford to go back and add more content. That's rarely the case. It's usually that it's too small. And you can also kind of get a sense of the pixelation of some figures you might have or logo. So just kind of blowing it up to real size without killing a bunch of trees by test printing is a really nice way to do that. And then just have like a measuring tape or something so you know it's to scale in real life. A few other small tips again, color picking branding colors has been a pretty popular topic I'm seeing these days. So I just picked the Columbia University Medical Center navy color here. And this is using Adobe Illustrator. Basically, what I'll do sometimes is grab all of the, I guess, headers and background elements, and then color pick from the logo. So that way, it kind of looks branded to your institution. So definitely try that out. And then any kind of other color elements or patterns you select should match with this main dominant branding color. So maybe it's a lighter blue, maybe it's a light shade of orange, because orange is the kind of complementary color of blue. but I would really limit it to one or two colors when you're kind of going around and picking the colors for your poster. And great tip from Saeed, I think. I hope I pronounced that right. Many schools do have pre-designed templates for posters. Um, it sounds like you don't like it personally, and sometimes they aren't well designed. I know UCSF has a really nice, I think they just have a really great graphics department. So they have a nice poster template I think you can download if you're a UCSF student or faculty. But you can actually get a preview of their poster designs on their website, I believe. Another thing about text is to avoid what we call widows and orphans, and this is just jargon in the design world. But basically, what it is these sort of hanging words outside of paragraphs, and it not only breaks up the text as far as being able to be legible from column to column, it actually takes up a lot of space. So you see beside the word widow and orphan, there's all that blank space um, that actually tends to take up more space than needed when you can actually tuck it away into the previous line. So here it is in practice. You probably read some books that have, one word in the next page, and sometimes you have to kind of flip back and forth between what that last paragraph said and the next. So just to avoid that, specific to posters, sometimes it'll happen in the title. Sometimes it'll happen, within the sections. So, when you see something like this, you can see all of the sort of wasted space around the edges. And similar to, graphical abstracts and grant images, space is definitely a commodity that you want to reserve. So this is something that you can do to claim back that space. And I see Brian just mentioned justify your text. Absolutely agree. I'm actually going to be talking about that in the next slide. So you read my mind here. So there it is tucked away, very clean. Most of design, actually, the secret is it's going to take a lot of what we call pixel pushing and just finessing those last little bits to make everything fit in a nice grid system. You can see this template, even though it's kind of a mock-up, it does have that nice even padding all the way around. And it's a little bit exaggerated here because, the padding's quite thick, but it's just really to drive home the fact that you need to maintain a lot of this padding between the sections. So as was mentioned, aligning your poster sometimes actually relates mostly to the text. So here's what I mean. Within PowerPoint, I like to justify the text. If you're using an advanced software like Illustrator, they actually have justify with the last line left aligned. So there's a little bit of a power move, but a power user move. But it actually does make a difference when that last sentence has one word that stretches across the whole line. So try that out if you are literate in the Adobe products. Here it is in practice. So in the design world, in industry, we use justified text to kind of really align objects and pictures to the text below. So there's no arrow or box around the portraits with the paragraphs below. You just know that they're associated with each other because there's these sort of columns that are created with the justified text. So I hope you're seeing that here and that it makes sense. Another example here where, again, the text is aligned really nicely, it's justified, and we've actually created columns using the text itself. So the text itself almost becomes the graphical element. And finally, before we dive into the sort of demo, poster-specific figure formatting. So figures themselves, you can, usually just grab your graphical abstract or your thesis image or what have you, and then sort of throw it into your poster. Just keep in mind that when you're looking at a poster, it's actually a little bit different than, flipping through a journal or even your thesis pages or even a presentation. Posters are different because as somebody approaches your poster, they can actually see every figure from beginning to end, so kind of like, all the dirty laundry being shown all at once. So that means you have to be careful with the colors you use, the labels, the arrows. They should all be relatively consistent from one figure to another. Because if you're showing data that's, maybe red and blue, and then your figure uses those same red and blue elements, your viewer is actually going to make that connection that maybe they're related because everything is visible right from the get-go. I'd also definitely encourage using numbers such as, 1, 2, 3, ABC. This goes for basically any image that has, a sequential, stepwise illustration. Um, Definitely leads the eye throughout the scene. And again, going back to that Chicago versus Paris analogy, anything you can do to lead your viewer's eye without, physically being there to sort of point and direct them throughout your poster or figure is going to be helpful in the long run. Okay, so going back as a refresher here on the five kind of general concepts that we'd love to cover in this kind of poster making demo is, consistent margins and padding. Again, going through using grid lines, making sure there's enough padding between the logo, title, subheadings. I'd also arrange your sections in a grid, as I mentioned, thinking about that Chicago versus Paris map. Pick one section to highlight. So you can try the sort of TLDR format that we've suggested. But generally speaking, I think we've seen the results or methods sections as sort of the main event of your poster. Color, background, and gradients, we already addressed. Don't use gradients as a background and color pick where you can and stick to 1 or 2 color shades. And then again, poster specific figure formatting. Okay, great. Seeing a lot of really great comments here in the chat. So what I'm going to do is exit full screen mode here and then go into a poster design that was actually volunteered by one of our researchers that we'd collaborated with. And here we go. And I'm not going to go into sort of presentation mode because I'll kind of use the workspace here. Um, I'm curious actually if anyone has used Google Slides to make a poster before. It actually is like not that bad, surprisingly, um, but quite similar to PowerPoint. So a little bit limited. It's definitely not a design tool, but a great alternative if you don't know how to use Adobe Illustrator, which is quite an advanced tool. So thank you, Anya, for volunteering this. Also to our creative director here at BioRender, her name is QC, and she actually did all and most, I would say, of the scientific research going on behind sort of the poster research efforts. So she had prepared these following slides for us to go through. So this was the before image. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit so you can see. Very typical. I would say, you've probably seen a poster like this. Maybe it looks similar to one that, you've created in the past. And one thing about Google Slides that's not great is the zoom feature here. um, okay, so things that I do when I approach a poster is, I ask a few questions, look at, the things that I like about what's going on in the poster and things that I maybe would love to revise. So the first thing I do is kind of, before I do the overhaul or the redesign, I kind of get a general feeling of how it's looking. So to me, I like the band of color on top here. I like the large, colorful graphics happening. Um, what else? It's feeling a little bit cluttered in some areas. Maybe not enough breathing room between the sections, I'd say. It is nicely boxed off, but that's causing a little bit of constriction here between the columns. The title doesn't quite stand out to me. It looks like the author names are kind of competing with the title itself. And in general, I'm not quite sure where to lead my eye. So, kind of where to start and where to end. I think they want me to look from, left to right, up and down, but I'm not sure. I could kind of read left to right. It's not really explicit as to where I should be looking. The sizes of the figures also feel a little bit uneven to me. So some are very large, some are very small, which is actually okay, but maybe we can arrange these a little bit more, as I mentioned, in that sort of grid-like format to make it a bit more professional looking. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. Um, this is very common. So, kind of as you hash out your grid system, make sure your figures are also then centrally, I guess, aligned, or, make sure that padding is even all the way throughout. So something like this, if you can see my screen, I'll actually move this up a little bit. Oops. So instead of, A, B, C, D, where if you draw artificial boxes around it, you'll see that the boxes are very different size and also kind of separated unevenly. So what we do is go ahead and kind of clean that up and also make sure that the ABCD is very, very clear. And then sometimes they won't be exactly even, but at least it'll be balanced. So if you can kind of stack similar sized images on top of each other or beside to kind of fit it in this grid system, this is definitely a good tip to keep in mind. Because naturally you're not going to have, a perfect checkerboard. It's going to have a little bit of variation. So this is a good way to hack that. Sometimes you'll have to, renumber things, A, B, C, D, and switch around some images, but try to maintain this balance. Another thing, this seems really minor, but for some reason makes a really big difference. And that is when you're creating your subheadings for your poster, try to leave enough breathing room, even within the subheading. So I think you all know what I mean. When you have sort of the abstract title, methods, discussions, results, sometimes the text goes edge to edge like this. And if you've created the best poster with all the right padding and then you throw in text boxes like this, it tends to feel a little bit constricted. As far as color, we do recommend using, as I mentioned, a sort of consistent color palette and ones that kind of don't clash. One website I like to get inspiration from is adobe.color, I think it's called adobe.color.com. Adobe Color, color.adobe.com. So this is really neat, a bit of a diversion here, but you can actually go through and pick colors that are maybe specific to your color branding of your school. You can go up here and look at tabs or explore different, color palettes. Really neat color swatches. Some are a little bit more adventurous than others, but if you're looking for inspiration, on how to best color code your work, it has a sort of scientific approach to how you can match colors. So that's color.adobe.com. Going back here, um, I don't think these colors would pass the Adobe color test. So I would definitely go back and fix those colors up. Here's a fixed version of that, or a corrected version. So we're using a dark blue navy here, similar to that sort of Columbia color palette, and then a lighter blue for the, I guess, sections that you want to downplay. So if I'm walking through a poster hall and I come across this poster, my eye is going to go straight to the title, which is certainly what you want them to see. Maybe the logo, maybe the authors, and then right to the results section, which is nice and large. It's clean, it's separated, it's numbered, and then maybe I'll want to stick around a little longer and read the abstract, intro, methods, and conclusion. Of course, always make sure to include your contact information. Sometimes, if you're looking for collaborators or you're a student looking for a PhD or a postdoc position, or you're a PI looking for students, there's no way to get in touch with you if you don't have your contact information on there. Of course, if you want to be contacted. If you don't, then leave it out. But definitely take advantage of the fact that a lot of people are going to be walking by your poster. Why not just have an easy way to get contacted? So starting off, I see some questions there of how to create a vertical sort of format poster. So the example I'm going to use today is actually for a vertical format. It's actually very popular, I believe, at a lot of European conferences. I don't see it as often in American conferences or US conferences. I could be wrong, but again, there's no right or wrong way to create a poster. Sometimes the conferences will have restrictions, so take a look at those and adhere to those closely. A lot of the principles that we'll cover, though, it will be pretty universal. So, even if you are creating a landscape poster, hopefully a lot of these tips will apply. So this is what I'll do initially. I'll kind of go in and sketch out the sections. So, throw in a title box, really, really rough, doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, if you get into the nitty gritty, that's probably where you'll start to get lost and then forget about things like margins and padding. So just throw in, your general guides, maybe the general sections that you want to include, general color palette. I'm thinking for this one, we're going to highlight the results section because going back to her poster here, the results section kind of, I think, takes up almost 2 columns. Not quite sure where it starts and begins though. So we're going to go ahead and sketch out a big, nice area that allows for a nice big results section. And then kind of roughly sketching out the, I guess, grid system, again, of the results figures and captions. And then leaving a little bit of space at the end here for some acknowledgements, again, contact information, things like that. You should always account for those early on and just block it off. This is actually how you would approach even an oil painting or, how fine artists approach artwork. They just kind of sketch in the rough blocks, the rough larger shapes before going into the details. And again, this is kind of the TLDR format, and we'll actually link this out as a template later on if you want to try it out yourself. But we really liked this during our poster research sessions, where you have almost like a table of contents rolling down the left here, and then a really nice large feature or highlighted section. Because really, if someone's walking by your poster, they're not going to have that much time to invest or mental capacity or bandwidth to consume all of the stuff on your poster. So really highlight the most important one. And maybe you can swap out results for methods if that's actually more important to your story. So just sketch out the sections like this. Again, about 90% of the time, I think it will be the results section that you'll want to highlight. And actually going back to this sketch phase, in Google Slides, this is the sort of Google product if you haven't used it already, you can actually use their guideline system. So I just turned them on, and previously, I had created these sort of guides and grids, but basically what you do is you pull from the ruler section like this. I'm just going to click down on the ruler, and then you can drag a guideline into your poster like this. So I'm going to line it over here. It's going to look a little bit crazy as you go through adding all these grids, but it's really important at this point, now that you've roughly sketched it out, kind of, aligning things to where you want it to land. So they become kind of your rule book as far as where not to include information and where to include information. So, as I zoom in here, I'm going to start to arrange the subheadings to fit. And it's not going to be perfect, but it'll be a nice rough guideline to make sure everything's aligned, centered. I'll do the same for these. The results, should be aligned again to the sort of intro. Maybe I'll grab another ruler down here. So kind of going through using grid lines as your friend. And then, once you've done that, hopefully you'll come out with a little bit more of an aligned, hide rulers, a little bit more of a clean alignment. So you see here, using the grid system, we're able to create even padding all the way throughout the design. So once you've got that in place, things are still going to move around. So don't worry that, everything's perfect or in place yet. Things will certainly move around from here on out. Start to throw in some images, maybe some captions. Again, don't make it perfect at this point, just kind of throw them in. At this point, what I usually do is think about the images that are going to take up the most amount of space. So things that are commanding more information or commanding higher resolution. Sometimes I'll, give that its own panel. And then again, as you mentioned, text itself does create a lot of the design elements. So make sure you account for the text as well. So I'm just kind of pretend that this is actual content. Gonna shrink it down. So, and then you can start, adding in your captions for your figures. The nice thing is that this app actually has this kind of auto snap to align. So it kind of ensures that I'm still staying within the grid system. And again, this is sort of theoretical captions as if they were all the exact same word length. Probably won't happen in real life this way, but. And I also mentioned it's going to be hard to find exactly the same size figure for every panel. And that's okay because, as long as I mentioned, you have a good balance. So say, for example, this figure is going to be a little bit shorter, make sure that the figure then that follows is a little bit longer. And then you kind of have a nice, I guess, masonry is what we call it format. So maybe this one's also a little bit shorter. And then this one's a bit longer. Just try to make it so that it's at least, balanced from left to right if it's asymmetrical. So just kind of finesse that. I would also try to include, and this kind of goes without saying, more pictures than text. It's hard to do, but hopefully you can try BioRender to export figures and create them and kind of replace a lot of the text-heavy areas of your poster. So something like this. I'm actually just gonna screenshot that. This is BioRender, by the way, if you haven't used it before. This is kind of the interface of it. And then going back to, you can see that even having numbered figures inside your poster is pretty important, like so. And sorry, I'm zooming in and out here. So again, Google Slides is not the best zooming function. I'm gonna fit it to the screen. There we go. Oh, by the way, if you create anything in Google Slide and you export, it actually exports as a PowerPoint format. So that's really nice. So I'm going to continue the design here, fleshing out a little bit more of those graphics. I've kind of added into the empty boxes there. I've completely eliminated the text in the methods section, which is great. So, no language barriers there. If you've got non-English speaking audiences, they can literally understand what you're doing here, maybe find collaborators and, really reducing that communication barrier. One thing you'll also notice is we kind of downplayed the author names here. Of course, the authors are important, but if you haven't captured them with your results or your title, then there really isn't a point of highlighting your name. So this is important to make sure that you actually pick the hierarchy of your text and what parts of your poster you really want to stand out. And one thing I'll kind of note here as a final touch for posters is throwing in numbers. So for the results section, sometimes we'll just leave it as is. This looks great, but I still don't quite know, where should I start and begin or start and end, the story? How do I follow? So we came up with this kind of triangular numbering system. We tried a whole bunch of ways. We tried the sort of circle with the number in it. It was a little hard to align circles to squares. You're welcome to try that too. It's certainly a nice touch. But we actually tried this kind of, triangle with number in it. It actually worked quite nicely. So Maybe you can test that out, see if it works for you. But it kind of tucks away nicely into this box. And this is a really granular tip, so I hope I'm not getting too much into the weeds here, but basically, really nice way to lead the eye again all throughout the page. Thanks, Darpan. Yeah, I liked it too. I think we were just brainstorming and it kind of came to us. Um, and once you've got the design, you can actually start getting creative with the colors. So, what you can do is start going in and maybe even, picking the things that are the most important parts of your story. And then, let's see, I could do something crazy like go with red. Looks like kind of that Harvard or, maroon color. And then the secondary colors into maybe a lighter shade of red or maybe an orange. And that actually looks pretty nice. So once you have your design laid out and you've created your hierarchy, which is title, main section you want to highlight, and then hopefully, your numbering system, you can actually get pretty creative with the colors you pick. Well, that's the blue, and that's the kind of orangey red. There's a purple version, I think, ultimately that we went with because the researcher preferred this sort of purple color palette, which is quite nice. So let's look at the kind of before and after here. And going back to what I said in the beginning of, us liking the large panel on the top, liking the kind of large images in the main results section, but not really knowing, maybe what the title is or where it is, no hierarchy of text, where to lead my eye from beginning to end, and then having some breathing room. And let's see if we've accomplished that. So I think it looks much, much cleaner, much more open, very kind of easy to now toggle between different color options, really big, beautiful images as well. Really pared down text. This probably also took a lot of time in thinking, as I mentioned, prepare this ahead of time so that you're not spending a lot of time, as you're designing in the weeds, trying to pare down the text. As much as you can pare down, definitely try to do that. And then, the figures are nice and grid lined and, even spacing all around the margins. So I think overall successful. We also threw in a PNG version of the logo here. So sometimes it's hard to find the white version of a lot of logos. If your school has one, great. It works really well in these cases. Sometimes if you are familiar with Illustrator, it takes a little bit of finicking within an editing software like that. Great, thank you. Hope you all learned a thing or two. And, hopefully when all this is over and where you come out of social isolation, you can all make a poster and actually present it at a conference in person. Excellent. Thank you so much for the great feedback. Really appreciate you sticking around to the very end. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.